Swayback Mountain by Butterscotch Sundae. Love is a force of nature. In the Swayback Mountains, a violent storm and its aftermath forced Rarity and Applejack to reappraise their feelings for each other. Illustration by the awesome Jack Neurotic. It has 3 chapters, each one about 3,000 words, coming to an 8,000 words total, almost 9,000. Chapter 1 of Swayback Mountain.
Are you sure you really need all the stuff, Rarity?
Applejack looked over the bulging saddlebags that the unicorn pony was carrying with difficulty up the sloping mountain path.
We ain't going to one of your fashion shows, you know.
Of course I know that, darling. Rarity was short of breath and kept shifting the saddlebag so that they would sit more balanced on her back. But when you said you were planning on going to the Swayback Mountains, I just had to come along with you.
You see?
Frowned Applejack.
I just don't get why you need to travel so far to collect berries. The whole forest of berries right next to Ponyville.
That's better. The saddlebags, which had been threatening to pull Rarity over, were finally sitting correctly. But darling, I already explained. I don't need just any common berries. I need special berries that only grow in the Swayback Mountains. They're the only berries in all of Equestria whose juice is as perfect as yours, and I just need that color dye for my latest range of accessories. Not that a pony such as... She looked at Applejack up and down critically. Close to earth, as you are, my dear, would understand that.
I understand plenty fine, little miss. Everything has to be perfect.
Applejack shook her head.
I never should have told you that I was going to compete in the rodeo in Cold Springs and that Swayback Mountains was right on my way.
Rarity sniffled. Well, seeing as how we're already climbing these beastly mountains, I suggest that we make the best of a bad situation. She broke into a full trot and passed Applejack, who snorted in frustration. The indigo-maned unicorn was as much trouble as a barrel of Paris Sprites. Applejack was about to catch up with her when she heard a low rumble from behind them. She turned and saw a rank of black clouds being pushed into position by a squad of Pegasus ponies. She groaned and hit her head with her hoof.
Now, how in tarnation did I forget that there was supposed to be a thunderstorm planned for tonight?
She broke into a trot, then a gallop, and then as she sped past Rarity, who was already puffing from the thinner air in the mountains, she cried,
You better put your running shoes on, little missy. There's a storm brewing, and it's coming right for us.
Rarity looked back and cried out, Eep! She broke into a gallop as well, and was soon next to Applejack. I just would have to have forgotten my raincoat, she complained, and now with all this galloping, I'm getting absolutely coated in dust and perspiration.
You sure are sweating like a brass pig.
Applejack laughed. Rarity said nothing and merely turned her snout up in disgust at such a vulgar comparison. To the south, in the skies over Ponyville, Rainbow Dash groaned in frustration. The Pegasus ponies were all pushing the dark clouds in completely the wrong directions, and things were getting out of hand. Clouds crashed against clouds, lightning flashed, thunder roared, and rain started to soak exactly the wrong parts of the countryside. That ditsy-do! Dash muttered. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This is the last time I let her organize a downpour. She jetted off to the area where Ditsy-Do and several other less experienced Pegasus ponies were mashing together the small storm clouds, piling them up into a gigantic thunderhead. But Dash was too late to prevent disaster. It flashed with a sudden eye-shattering streak of errant lightning, and the thunder that followed rolled over the landscape like a shock wave. The rain started to fall softly at first, in brief squalls that passed by as swiftly as they came. The thunderstorm was still far off, but Applejack knew it was going to be a huge one. Just what do those Pegasus ponies think they're doing? Applejack thought to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. They're just big old show-offs. And speaking of show-offs, she turned back to Rarity, was struggling to keep up with her. The unicorn pony saddlebags were slowing her down, and her mane was wet with sweat as well as rain.
Come on, princess,
said Applejack.
At this rate, we ain't gonna reach the river before nightfall, and as sure as apples don't want to camp where there's liable to be a landslide.
Just, Rarity panted, redoubling her efforts. Let me catch my breath for a moment. Applejack groaned, but she stopped to let Rarity catch up.
As soon as we're over the rocks, it'll be all downhill.
Rarity nodded, throwing a foreleg over Applejack's shoulder and leaned against the earth pony as she gasped for air. It may be that I did pack a few too many items. Applejack looked at the bulging saddlebags.
Just what did you pack? We're only gonna be going for 3 days tops.
Well, said Rarity, her face no longer as flushed as before, there's 3 days worth of outfits, of course, and each outfit naturally needs a small selection of accessories to go with it, so that I'm ready for any kind of situation. And there's my makeup box, and since I have no idea what kind of lighting to expect in Cold Springs, I simply had to bring all of my foundation so as to not be caught off. You see, Applejack, Rarity raised her nose into the air, and her face grew haughty. Not every pony can be as reckless and fly by the seat of your saddle as you are, my dear. I must be ready for every eventuality, or else I should look ridiculous in front of every pony, and fashion death is simply quite the most dire of fates. She tossed her mane in emphasis. Applejack rolled her eyes in irritation.
I can think of a dozen worse things than looking like the foal in front of others. Being struck by lightning and swept away by a raging torrent being foremost in my mind at the moment.
She was gesturing towards the approaching black thunderhead and the blue haze of torrential rain beneath it that was sweeping across the countryside towards them.
Now let's get going.
Not long after they reached the ridge top, but the path down the mountainside was almost invisible now. The sky covered in cloud, and twilight spread over them. Applejack led the way, generally testing every new ledge of rock to make sure it was safe, and Rarity stuck close behind her.
Don't follow quite so close,
warned Applejack.
Or else we'll both end up on the bottom of this mountain a lot faster than we expect.
Rarity stopped abruptly. Some scree loosened under her hooves, fell away down the mountainside, and she jumped back with a yelp. The rocks fell for several heartbeats, then clattered ominously somewhere far below.
What did I tell you?
Rarity moaned. I don't think I can go on, she sobbed. I can't see a thing. Applejack flashed in anger.
You gotta go on, Missy. Else the rain will catch up with us, and then these rocks will be slippery as well.
Rarity closed her eyes and swallowed. She nodded. Very well. Let's get going, then. Progress was slow, but with Applejack's sharp cajoling and the threatening peals of thunder that came sooner and sooner after the flashes of lightning that gave birth to them, Rarity found the courage to go on. They were almost at the bottom of the mountain. Beneath them, the river that flowed down the mountains and across the plains to Cold Springs became visible, appearing as a sinuous cobalt-gray path with every flash of lightning.
Just a small ways left now, Rarity,
said Applejack.
Then a quick gallop across the bridge, and we'll be on the other side. We can make camp under one of those rocky outcrops.
Oh, thanks, Alessia, Rarity cried. I simply can't wait to be out of these wet and sticky saddlebags. Let's hurry up and... But in her haste to move on, the unicorn's hoof came down too hard on a rock hidden in front of her by the wet mud. She slipped backwards, landed on her side, and started sliding precipitously down the path. Rocks and mud came away with her, and then Applejack had no time to react as the muddy unicorn pony and part of the mountainside struck her and knocked her off her feet. Together, spattered in mud and screaming, they careened down the path, dislodging more stones and mud as they went. 3 heartbeats later they reached the bottom, but they didn't stop. Close to the river and the mud was even deeper, and although they were both able to right themselves, they kept sliding, their hoofs skating across the bank. And with a colossal splash, they fell into the bitterly cold water of the river. Applejack surfaced first, coughing and spluttering.
Rarity! Rarity!
She cried out, but her friend was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Rarity surfaced near her. She was coughing as well, dazed but uninjured.
Come on, little Missy,
said Applejack, taking hold of Rarity's saddlebags in her mouth and pulling her towards the opposite bank.
Swim harder.
I can't swim, Rarity cried. I can only pony paddle.
Then pony paddle as hard as you can.
Several desperate minutes later, they were on the other side of the stream. It wasn't so muddy there, and Applejack pulled Rarity from the water and the wet sand. The unicorn pony coughed up some more water, but she managed to raise her head and smile at Applejack. Rarity's eyes were moist from tears, river water, and rain. "Oh, my darling Applejack!" she breathed, getting onto her feet with difficulty, and Pony hugging Applejack by putting her neck over her friend's and nuzzling her cheek. "You saved my life!" Applejack's eyes flashed with anger, but then a flush of overwhelming relief washed over her, and she softened. They were safe. She pulled out of the hug and smiled at the grateful unicorn pony.
"Oh, shucks, Rarity,"
she replied.
"'Twa'n't nothing at all."
She lowered her eyes in modesty, but she had opened them when she heard Rarity shriek. "Applejack!" Rarity cried. "Your hat! It's gone!"
"My hat?"
Applejack lifted a hoof and felt her head all over. Rarity was right. It was gone.
"My hat!"
Applejack burst into tears, and Rarity looked at her in shock. She had never seen the Earth Pony so upset.
"My hat! It's gone! I've gone and lost it!"
"Oh, my dear!" What? Rarity said. "I'll make you a new one as soon as we get back to Ponyville. Don't you worry about—"
"You don't understand,"
cried Applejack.
"That was my pappy's hat.
She sobbed.
The last time I saw him alive, he took it off his head and gave it to me. He said, 'This is yours now, my little apple bucker. Keep this hat here safe, and don't forget your pappy loved you more than anything else in the world.'"
Rarity's eyes welled up, but they grew steely. She shook the tears from her eyes and jerked her head out of the wet saddlebags. "I'll find your hat, darling," she said, galloping away at full speed downstream along the beach.
"Wait! Rarity!"
Applejack shouted out to her, but the unicorn pony didn't stop. "The silly filly is gonna do something crazy. I just know it." Oh, sorry.
That's cool.
There's no
That
difference.
silly filly's gonna...
Go ahead.
Yeah. That silly filly is gonna do something crazy. I just know it.
By the time she caught up, Rarity had spotted Applejack's hat floating in the river. It was almost invisible, but it was her hat all right. Rarity stopped and stabbed her horn into the air. Purple azure energy sparked along it, and in the river the hat was surrounded in the same light, but it quickly flickered and faded. "It's too far away," Rarity said in frustration.
"Rarity! Don't do nothing silly."
But the unicorn pony had already leapt into the river and was paddling towards the hat.
"Oh, pony feathers, why don't you ever listen to me?"
Applejack galloped up the beach to keep alongside her. Rarity was right behind the hat now, and the purple magic once again sprang into life along her horn. This time, the glow remained strong, and with difficulty she lifted the hat out of the water and floated it across to Applejack on the shore. Once the glow flickered, and Rarity almost dropped it, but she bit her lip, squeezed her eyes shut, and with a final burst of magic, the hat at least made it to the river bank. Applejack grabbed it in her mouth and flung it far from the water, for she could see that Rarity was exhausted and barely able to keep her head above the water. Then the unicorn suddenly stopped swimming and slipped under the water. Applejack leaped into the river and in moments was right next to where she'd last seen her friend. She took a deep breath and dived down, searching with her mouth and forehoofs for Rarity in the black swirling water. An age later, her lungs burned and she was forced to surface again. But with a desperate sucking in of air, she straight away dived down again. And this time she found her. With no saddlebags to grab this time, Applejack had Rarity's curly tail in her mouth, and painfully she dragged her sobbing and unconscious friend from the water.
"Oh, Rarity,"
Applejack muttered, wiping the water from the unicorn's pony's face.
"What you done to yourself? You crazy little filly."
She put her cheek to her friend's mouth. Rarity wasn't breathing. Applejack didn't hesitate, but at once took a deep breath, put her lips against Rarity's blue pale ones, and breathed out.
"Breathe, you darn! Breathe, darn you, breathe! Don't give up on me, Rarity! Breathe!"
Applejack stepped back and looked at her friend. She lay there, unmoving, in the dark. the rain falling all about her. Next, tears burst out in Applejack's eyes.
No. Oh, Celestia, please, no.
She whispered. But then Rarity groaned, so soft. Applejack thought she must have imagined it.
Rarity?
She brought her face close and nuzzled the unicorn pony's cheek. Rarity groaned louder and started to cough, and water then suddenly dribbled from between her lips. Applejack quickly turned her onto her side and held her as wave after wave of river water poured out from her mouth.
Oh, thanks, Celestia,
said Applejack, patting Rarity on her back to help dislodge the last of the water she had breathed in.
You're breathing again. You're okay.
Applejack's top lip quivered.
For a minute there, I thought I'd lost you,
she whispered. Rarity looked up at Applejack groggily. The unicorn's pony, beautiful indigo mane, wet and tangled, was plastered to her face and neck. Her coat was caked in mud and river weeds. It broke Applejack's heart to see Rarity in such a state. But then the unicorn pony smiled at her. Darling, she whispered, there's no way I could go anywhere looking like this.
Does it hurt anywhere, Rarity?
Applejack asked in concern.
Do you need anything?
Rarity looked up at her friend and whispered, Do you have a mirror? And then Applejack at last allowed herself to burst into tears. With Rarity too weak to help, it took a long time for Applejack to set up the tent. Most of the pegs were lying on the bottom of the river. She was forced to collect heavy rocks and roll them onto the edges of tarpaulin to keep the material in place. The wind was growing wilder with every passing moment, tearing at the tent and threatening to blow it into the air. From the dryness of the nook under the outcropping, Rarity watched Applejack struggling in the rain. Applejack had wrapped her up in all that was left of the outfit she had brought with her. The rest were floating downstream somewhere, never to be seen or admired by any pony ever again. The outer layers of Rarity's warm cocoon was exquisitely sequined party dress she had brought with her in case there was some kind of special social event after the rodeo. She chuckled grimly. If only the gentle coals of Cold Spring could see her now. The muddy river water had gotten into her saddlebags and ruined it. Half of the sequins were missing, and it was stained with mud beyond repair. In a few moments, the gorgeous creation she had been so proud of, gazing on it as it glistening on its dressmaker's doll in a boutique, had become little more than a filthy rag. Rarity held back tears. All of those days of hard work, sewing each individual sequin in perfectly straight lines, wasted. In her weakened state, Rarity felt absolutely useless. She tried to get up and help Applejack earlier. It was too much for her to stand, watching the earth pony work so stoically, so selflessly, in that cold, dark maelstrom of wind and rain. But then a sudden wave of weakness had set onto her entire body, troubling, and she slumped back into the ground. Applejack had galloped up to her, her eyes furiously berating her.
You try and move yourself one more time, little missy, and I'll come and roll some rocks on top of you as well.
Rarity had lowered her eyes. I'm so sorry, Applejack. I just feel so terrible that I can't be of any assistance to you, darling, she sniffled. And all of this is my fault. If I had only been more careful deciding where to put these big, clumsy hooves of mine.
Now, don't you worry yourself about that, Rarity,
Applejack had replied. The unicorn's distress had touched her.
It was just an accident, is all. Could have happened to any pony.
It wouldn't have happened to you, Rarity had replied, softly so that Applejack couldn't hear her as she walked back into the rain. You always know the right thing to do. Applejack rolled the final rock into place.
There,
she said in a triumph. Even wearing her oilskin coat and hat, she was sopping wet, and she took herself over to the corner of a nook away from where Rarity was sitting and shook herself dry.
Now let's get out of this wind and get warmed up.
Rarity nodded. Even wrapped in so many layers, the wind was cutting into her, and her bones ached, and her teeth chattered with the cold. The two ponies crawled under the tent flap into the dry, dark warmth inside. It was still daylight, but with the black clouds of the storm blocking out the sun, it was as if it was the middle of the night inside the tent. Applejack flicked on a torch with her mouth and placed it in the corner of the tent. Its pale yellow light made huge shadows of the two ponies against the side of the tent, and Rarity's eyes suddenly lit up in delight when she saw them. Even wrapped up in rags, I have such a svelte silhouette, she beamed, striking a pose. And Applejack, just look at you! She pointed at Applejack's silhouette magnified on the wall of the tent. You know, my dear, your cowboy hat really is so charming. Its wide brim is simply perfect for the perfect accessory for your ponytail. It balances it so well. Applejack lay down, exhausted, and watched Rarity as she tried different glamorous poses, her silhouette mirroring them. She was tired, and part of her was still angry at the unicorn pony, as she looked at her own shadow, wearing her pappy's cowboy hat, the memory of Rarity leaping into the river to save it without hesitation made the anger melt away as quickly as it had come. Applejack closed her eyes for a moment, without realizing it, dozed off. When she opened her eyes again, she saw that Rarity was curled up beside her, fast asleep. The unicorn had earlier washed all the mud and the weeds off of herself as best as she could with the rainwater, but her coat was still smudged with dirt, and her mane was all clumped together in places. Applejack smiled at her smiling face, the heavy eyelashes fluttering slightly as she dreamed, and she licked the unicorn's wet cheek. After all their adventures today, Rarity still looked so beautiful. Applejack sighed and curled against her for warmth.
And just how in tarnation can you smell so sweet after sliding down a mountainslide and wading through a river of mud? You smell just like you left one of those fancy spas.
She chuckled.
Like flowers and soap and sandalwood all bundled up together. Unicorn magic must be.
And then, as the rain continued to patter and hiss outside, the thunder rolled and growled. Applejack fell asleep as well. When Applejack awoke, the light inside the tent was as dull as the gray of the early dawn.
Those Pegasus ponies must have finally got their act together,
she thought in relief. The first event of the rodeo was scheduled for early in the afternoon, and with a bit of luck and some determined hiking, they'd be able to get to Cold Springs in time. She looked down at Rarity, swaddled in her layers of clothing like a baby. She was still fast asleep, and Applejack snorted in annoyance.
Come on, Rarity. Not like you need your beauty sleep.
She nudged the unicorn with a gentle hoof.
Time to rise and shine. If you don't get up, we won't have any time to find those berries you were after.
Rarity moaned a little, but she still didn't wake up. Applejack frowned and came closer. Rarity's face was pale, and the area around her horn was covered in sweat.
You okay, Rarity?
Applejack placed a hoof on the unicorn's forehead. She was burning up! Applejack straight away started to peel off the layers of water-stained clothes, putting them off of Rarity with her teeth. It was just unwrapping a mummy, but that image didn't seem at all funny to Applejack at the moment. She'd seen terrible things that could happen with a high fever. She remembered her pappy in all those long-lost days, confined to his bed at Sweet Apple Acres. He just looked like Rarity did now, pale and sweaty and so weak. Her pappy had always been such a huge and robust stallion. Big Macintosh was the spitting image of how he'd look in his younger days, dragging his plow out into the fields into the broiling sun, the sweat and heat of the labor beating down on his flanks and withers. Applejack remembered how she used to skip behind him, planting the apple seeds from little saddlebags, and all the while he'd pull the plow and look back at his daughter now and then, with pride and love in his dark eyes. And then when he'd fallen ill, the weight and muscle had fallen away from his frame, and he'd become so thin and fragile that Applejack and Big Macintosh had to help him into bed. He felt no heavier than a single bushel of apples. "Don't worry, little sis," Big Macintosh had told her one afternoon as she sat crying on the porch of the homestead, as so often she had done in those terrible days. "Pappy'll be fine. He just needs to get his strength back. Yup." But then Applejack had seen the tiny glimmer of doubt in her big brother's eyes, and she'd known at that moment that their pappy wasn't ever going to get any better. Rarity was unclothed now, lying on her side, her chest rising slowly as she breathed shallowly with difficulty. Applejack nuzzled her, but she didn't respond. Tears welled up in the corner of Applejack's eyes, but she angrily shook them away.
What you doing, you dumb rabbit? Crying like a filly that stubbed her hoof.
She riffled through her saddlebags, finally finding the water canister. She opened it and put it next to Rarity's mouth, but the unicorn pony didn't react. So she gently eased her head up and let some water trickle down into her mouth. Rarity coughed, but after a little while she started to swallow.
That's a good filly,
said Applejack. Jack? Rarity opened her eyes and looked at her friend. Her pupils were unfocused, and she seemed to half asleep still.
Applejack's here, Rarity,
replied Applejack. She sighed in relief.
Don't you worry.
Applejack?
Now don't you try and talk, Rarity. You got an awful high fever. You need to rest up, else.
She tipped the little remaining water in the canister into Rarity's mouth before she drank it. Rarity coughed again. So thirsty, Applejack. Applejack nodded.
Of course you are,
she replied.
You awful dehydrated.
She stood up and went to the flap of the tent.
Just you wait a short while. I'll be back soon. Just gotta find some fresh water.
The morning light was clear and crisp, and the air as fresh as Applejack followed the river a little way upstream. Thankfully, she didn't have to travel far to find water. She knew that there was a little spring somewhere in the rocky face of the ridge as it twisted away from the river and back into the foothills. Her pappy had been the one who'd shown first to her all those years ago, when she had made a journey to Cold Springs to watch her first rodeo with him. My little Applebucker, you got a real talent with the lasso, he told her as they traveled through the Swayback Mountains together. She'd been around Apple Bloom's age that time, and she was riding on her pappy's back, since her own short legs had become tired from walking. I seen you snare a rabbit from 15 feet away. That's no mean accomplishment for a little filly.
I told him I was sorry,
Applejack had sniffled. Her pappy had laughed a great rolling laugh that had echoed through the mountain. Applejack, that big old heart of you is 10 sizes too big for that little body of yours. He smiled at her. One day, you're gonna be something great. Applejack was so deep in reminiscence that she'd realized she'd already passed the spot. She doubled back a short way and at last found the spring. She nudged the canister into place and under the trickle of glistening water and watched it fill slowly.
I'm sorry, Pappy,
she whispered.
I trained so hard the whole year. I was sure this season I was going to make you proud.
Before he'd come to become an apple farmer, her pappy had been a rodeo star. He'd been famous. He'd been a famous name amongst the plain ponies for years, but he'd finally given it away to start a family. But one day, Applejack had found his old lasso in a box in the hayloft and had started practicing with it during break times on the farm in secret. She had gotten away with it for about a month before her pappy had stumbled upon her, trying to pull the lasso off a tree branch he'd snared. She thought he'd be angry, but instead he just watched her and smiled, a blade of grass in his mouth, until she finally got it loose. I always thought it would be Big Mactosh that inherited the spark, he explained, taking the lasso from her and showing her how to hold it correctly, loose and lightly. But it seems that old saying ain't wrong after all. It's sometimes the littlest apple seeds that grow into the tallest trees. The canister was full to overflowing, so Applejack capped it and picked it up with her mouth. A sudden feeling of loss and disappointment welled up in her. She realized that there was no way she'd been able to make it to the rodeo now. All those months of practice had been all for nothing, and all those dreams in honoring her pappy's name, all that because of that puffed-up unicorn pony. She galloped back up to the tent and angrily pushed her way inside through the flap.
I got your water, Rarity,
she said.
Are you feeling any better now?
Rarity lifted her head. A little, she managed to say. Applejack brought the canister to her lips, and this time Rarity was able to drink from it herself. Rarity watched Applejack as she drank. The earth pony had turned her back on her and was busy packing up her saddlebag. "What's the matter there, darling?" she asked. Then the realization dawned on her, and she said, "Oh."
Oh? Oh?
Applejack turned on her angrily.
Is that all you have to say for yourself? Oh?
Rarity's face fell at the angry onslaught. "Darling, I'm so sorry, so frightfully, terribly sorry. You won't be able to make it to the rodeo now, will you?" She couldn't look at Applejack's incriminating eyes any longer, and she stared at the floor of the tent. "And it's all my fault, isn't it?" she whispered.
All of it.
Applejack nodded.
Now just lay there and rest yourself while I get everything packed up. Should be able to get back to Ponyville before sundown.
Rarity got up unsteadily. "Don't you worry about me, Applejack," she said, starting to gather up her own clothes. "I'll be perfectly able to travel back to Ponyville on my own. You should go to the rodeo yourself. You'll surely make it without me slowing you down." Applejack shook her head.
You're still much too sick,
she said.
"There's no way you can make it back without my help."
Applejack turned back to her packing, and Rarity watched her crestfallen. The terrible feeling of guilt in her heart was far worse than the fever and the ache in her limbs as she lay back down. But as Applejack was busy stuffing her oilskin coat into the saddlebag, Rarity suddenly stepped forward and knocked over the water canister, its contents flowing all over the floor of the tent. "Oops," she said, and looked at Applejack fearfully. But the earth pony said nothing. She just stopped in the middle of her packing, walked over to Rarity in silence, and picked up the canister in her mouth. Applejack was seething after she left the tent. It was almost as if Rarity had spilled the water on purpose, but it didn't matter now anyway. She stoically galloped back to the spring and refilled the canister, and in a short while she returned to the tent. As she pushed open the flap, she said,
"Now don't spill this one, you hear?"
But then she noticed that the tent was empty except for her own half-packed saddlebags. Rarity and all of her belongings were gone. Rarity was just halfway across the rickety bridge that traversed the river where Applejack caught her at full gallop.
"Just wait a second, little missy,"
the earth pony shouted as she clambered onto the bridge.
"You ain't going nowhere in your condition."
Rarity looked back at Applejack. She had tears in her eyes. "Please, Applejack, just leave me alone. If you hurry, you can still make it to the rodeo." She continued walking. She stepped gingerly, yet with every hoof fall the bridge swung alarmingly.
"I don't care about that darn radio anymore,"
Applejack shouted back. She took a few steps towards Rarity. Rarity turned angrily. "You liar!" she cried. I didn't know just how disappointed you are." She lowered her eyes. "I know how much work you put into it. All those hours of practicing." Applejack frowned.
"How do you know about that? You never saw me practicing."
Rarity shook her head. I've been watching you practice," she explained. She kept her eyes lowered, embarrassed to meet Applejack's gaze. I was delivering a new shawl to Granny Smith about a month ago, and I got lost walking about the farm. I saw you behind the hay barn practicing." Rarity lifted her eyes. They were glistening. "There was just so much passion in your eyes, Applejack. I simply couldn't turn away. Something in you made me keep watching you, and the longer I watched, the more embarrassed it became. I didn't interrupt you because I didn't want you to find out what I've been doing."
"You've been watching me?"
Applejack repeated, puzzled.
"What's wrong with that?"
Rarity's eyes flared. "You silly, silly pony!" she shouted. "You just don't understand anything, do you?" And without any other word, she turned and started towards the far end of the bridge. But Applejack wasn't about to let Rarity go. She pulled out her lasso from her saddlebags, and with her tail she started to swing it around her head. Rarity was almost at the other end of the bridge when Applejack cast it. The noose slipped around the unicorn's back legs, and with a quick jerk of Applejack's tail, it tightened, tying her legs together. Rarity yelped, fell forwards on her stomach. She was dazed for a moment, but then she turned back and glared at Applejack. Just what do you think you're doing? She demanded.
I told you you weren't going anywhere,
Chuckled Applejack, steadily winding up the length of rope with her tail as she walked towards her quarry. Applejack, untie me this instant!
It's all for the best, Rarity.
Applejack kept the rope taut, and when she'd passed Rarity, she turned and slipping it on her head under the unicorn's pony's chest, she lifted her onto her back with a grunt. What is this? Rarity squealed. Put me down! She beat her forehoofs against Applejack's flank, but the earth pony just ignored her.
Quit you squirming,
Chastised Applejack. She was glad Rarity couldn't see the smile she wore on her face.
You're worse than a sheep on dipping day.
In her weakened state, Rarity stopped struggling almost immediately and collapsed atop of Applejack as she carried her back to the tent. With her face flush against the earth pony's back, Rarity felt the heat rising from Applejack's body. She closed her eyes and rubbed her cheeks against Applejack's orange coat as she breathed in the scent of perspiration, oilskin, and freshly cut hay. She could feel the solid yet subtle muscle beneath the Applejack's hide move against her face and under the forefeet as she walked. Applejack, started Rarity, in a voice almost too soft to hear.
Uh-huh,
The earth pony replied. I never knew you were so well built. Applejack shook her head. Just what? Oh, go ahead.
Just what was that cotton-headed filly going about now? That's what happens if you spend your day working in the fields. I suppose you work too much of a sweat in that boutique of yours.
She chuckled. Rarity sniffed. Just because I don't happen to be lifting any heavy loads and pulling in machinery doesn't mean I don't also work hard, she retorted.
I didn't mean it like that, Sugar Cube,
replied Applejack. Rarity was so light on her back, it was almost as if she was just skin and bones. But how Oh, go ahead.
No, how in tarnation did such a little slip of filly get to be so strong-willed and proud? I just mean that it's a sturdy physique is all, and parcel of being a farmer.
She laughed.
To tell the truth, Big Mac has always ribbed me for being so strong. He always said that I'm more like his little brother than his sister.
Rarity laughed. That big Macintosh! What a thing to say! Stallions have really no idea how to be sensitive to a lady's feelings. Applejack laughed as well.
Hey, I got that right. Next time I see Macintosh, I'm gonna tell him you said that.
Rarity slapped Applejack on the flank with a hoof. Darling, don't you dare say such a thing. You know Big Macintosh means well, and I'd just die if he knew we'd be talking about him like that. Applejack shook her head and laughed. It wasn't far to the tent now, and Rarity had been silent for a while.
Y'all comfortable up there, Rarity?
Asked Applejack. The unicorn pony said nothing in reply, but muttered. She'd fallen asleep again. Despite all the stubbornness and energy she'd displayed on earlier, Rarity was still far from well. Applejack slipped into the tent and gently eased Rarity off her back. As the unicorn pony slipped onto the floor of the tent, she woke up, and she hugged her forefeet around Applejack's shoulder, bringing them face to face. Applejack, my darling, I'm so sorry about everything that's happened. Applejack frowned.
I told you before there's no ill will between us. Just forget about it. I'm just glad you're okay.
Rarity broke the embrace, and she looked down at the noose around her legs. I promise I'm not going to run away, darling. Do you think you could? Applejack smiled.
Sure I can. I think you learned your lesson.
She loosened the knot with her teeth and slid it off Rarity's back feet. But after she had put the lasso away, she turned to Rarity, a quizzical look on her face.
You know, Rarity, can I, ask you a question?
Rarity nodded. Well, of course, darling, you can ask me anything.
Back on the bridge, when we were arguing,
Applejack explained.
You said I didn't understand nothing.
She frowned.
Now, I've thought and thought about what you said, but I just can't work out what you meant by it.
Rarity's face fell away. That? Oh, that was nothing, darling. I was just angry, and I wasn't thinking when I said it. Please, just forget about it. She turned away and curled up in a corner of the tent. I'm quite simply exhausted, and I want to. Applejack shook her head.
I just can't forget about it, Rarity. I saw that look you gave me.
She moved closer and, lifting Rarity's chin with a hoof, she looked the unicorn pony right in the eyes.
That wasn't just anger I saw in those eyes. You look like I just betrayed you.
Betrayed me? Rarity stuttered. Why, the thought never. Applejack's green eyes were deep and serious as she looked into Rarity's. There was heat between them, and a hidden silent emotion that scared her. She knew that she couldn't lie to Applejack. She wasn't a silly pony at all. She knew and felt a lot more than she'd ever said. Rarity knew that she was backed into a corner in more ways than one. It's true, darling. I did feel like I was betrayed, but it was unfair of me to say that. Tears moistened the corners of her azure eyes. I know you'll never feel about me the same way I feel about you because I think I'm in love with you, Applejack, she said, and the words hung in the dead silence between them for what felt like an eternity. A series of emotions flickered across Applejack's face. Confusion, shock. She turned away from Rarity and slowly nodded.
I guess I kinda knew that all along, Sugar Cube,
she said at last. Rarity's heart was breaking. The tears were flowing down her cheek now, wetting her chin and neck. I never wanted you to know, she whispered. I knew this would happen. Now we can't be friends anymore. She lowered her face and tears dripped steadily down onto the floor of the tent. But soon she felt Applejack's face close to hers, and she lifted her eyes. The earth pony was smiling at her, a sad and elusive smile.
Now, what did you think of that, Sugar Cube?
She asked. Rarity sniffled. It would just be too uncomfortable for you, she explained. If any pony caught me mooning over you, then there'd be a terrible scandal, and I could never live with myself if I dragged you down to my level.
Now, I ain't gonna say nothing about my own feelings yet,
replied Applejack.
Maybe I was surprised you felt that way. I ain't angry.
She shook her head.
I ain't angry at all. Truth is.
She smiled shyly.
I'm mighty flattered you feel that way about me.
You are? asked Rarity. Applejack nodded. Her green eyes sparked from deep within as she spoke.
Who wouldn't be flattered to have such a sophisticated and glamorous feelings of affection?
She said.
Let's dry those tears of yours, little missy. You got no reason to cry.
Rarity wiped her tears with her hooves. Applejack took the unicorn pony in her arms and laid her head on her chest as she nuzzled Rarity's neck.
You know, you ain't such a strong little feeling after all,
she said softly in her ear.
A little bit of emotion, and you fall to pieces.
Rarity felt Applejack's touch as electricity that ran tingling down her spine. She ached for it. She needed that touch, but it was so painful. She knew deep down she would never feel it ever again with passion, only as consolation. The touch of Applejack's lips prickled and maddened her. Tears sprung up anew in her eyes, but she hid them, smothering her face into Applejack's warm chest, and closed her eyes in bliss as Applejack's gentle breath touched her neck and ears. Oh, please, just this moment! Oh, Celestia, please, just let me have this moment! Let me just imagine and just believe for this moment that everything I desire is mine, truly mine, so that in my dreams I might always come back here and be happy for a short while at least. Applejack held Rarity for a while. She didn't show any sign of wanting to break the embrace. The truth was that there was the frail, slim pony unicorn in front of her had awoken strange feelings inside her, conflicting feelings that drove Applejack in one minute from confusion to fear to nervous excitement. Finally she whispered,
You know, Sugar Cube, here in this tent, we're about halfway between Ponyville and Cold Springs.
Rarity murmured. Applejack couldn't make out what she had said, but she continued. Something inside her was forcing her onward. She found the words escaping her lips, and she couldn't have stopped them if she wanted to.
You know, if anything happened in this tent, anything at all. So far away from anywhere that nobody would ever know about it.
Applejack's breath was hot.
Especially if it only ever happened once, for instance, and we never spoke about it again.
Rarity turned her face towards her. New tears had reddened her eyes, and she stared at Applejack. The Earth Pony stopped walking and slowly licked away the wetness on Rarity's cheeks. Applejack? She began.
Hush now.
The licking had turned to little kisses, and Applejack peppered Rarity's cheek and throat with them.
Those tears of yours near broke my heart in two. I can't stay to see you cry anymore.
Oh, Applejack! Rarity sobbed and threw her forefeet around Applejack's neck. The Earth Pony hugged her back, closing her eyes. She had thought that maybe it would feel strange, that holding Rarity in this way would feel wrong or creepy, but it didn't. They lay there, not moving, for what seemed like an age. It was Rarity that moved first. She raised her face and kissed Applejack once, on the mouth, softly, as if testing. And then again, and this second time, Applejack found herself kissing back. The Earth Pony's kiss was hesitant at first, unsure, but Rarity's kiss was hard and insistent, and Applejack found herself wanting more. The touch of Rarity's lips had done something to her. These feelings weren't new, she realized. She'd just been asleep for a long time. These were the same feelings that had every time melted the anger before so often she felt towards Rarity, the frustration of dealing with her stubbornness, her irritating obsession with details, the resentment that Applejack had felt after all the attention that the gorgeous unicorn pony got from the stallions of Ponyville because of her gracefulness and confidence. The soft spot that had always been there, that spot that had always argued away as just being a big sisterly concern for the young pony. Could it be that? Rarity felt the change in intensity of Applejack's kissing. She rolled her eyes in pleasure as the Earth Pony kisses grew bolder, turning down her throat and turning into sharp nips of her teeth. Oh, Applejack, she sighed. Harder, darling. Harder so that I can feel it. Applejack looked up at Rarity. Her features were so delicate and angelic, and she seemed so vulnerable. Her azure eyes with the thick lashes fluttering each time Applejack bit in her coat, her head thrown back in abandon. The Earth Pony's heart burned in her chest, and she felt a rush of heat along her body. She felt her insides melting, the subtle fire running along her limbs and dissolving her bones away. Rarity nibbled lightly on Applejack's ear. The Earth Pony was flushed and panted with pleasure. You look like you're ready to learn a few new things, Rarity whispered as she turned the Earth Pony over to her stomach and began to lick away down her back and along her spine. Applejack's coat was salty with perspiration and musky scent of her excitement, and the musky scent of her excitement engulfed Rarity's senses as she kissed ever lower. When Applejack woke up, Rarity was still fast asleep beside her, her mane covering her face. Applejack swept it aside, and the idyllic, blissful look on the unicorn pony's face made her melt again. The intensity of Rarity's passion had taken her by surprise. There was still so much Applejack didn't know about her. There was so much more to her than the fashion-obsessed filly that she first appeared. Why has it taken her so long for her to realize it? Color had returned to Rarity's face, and it was obvious her fever had broken. Applejack chuckled to herself.
So it ain't just an old man's smell that mess around can cure anything.
She kissed Rarity on her cheek, and then she murmured and smiled, but she didn't wake up.
I think it's safe for me to leave you for a short while, Sugar Cube,
she said, and slipped out of the tent flap.
You need to rest.
But a while later, Rarity woke up, and it felt like she had been asleep for hours. As the memory of what just happened flooded back, she turned over, a smile beaming on her face. Applejack, she began, but the Earth Pony wasn't there beside her. Rarity's smile fell away, and she sighed, wrapping herself in Applejack's blanket and breathing in her scent. Just one time, she sighed, but it's so much more than I ever dreamed of. Her eyes grew moist. Oh, Applejack, I hope you make it to the rodeo in time. There was a sudden stirring of movement outside the tent. Rarity squeaked and brought the blanket close to her chest. Who is it? She asked, voice trembling.
It's just me, Rarity.
It was Applejack. She poked her head in through the tent and threw a small bag across to Rarity. What is this?
Just a little present, Shug.
Applejack smiled. But the rodeo. Applejack was mock cross.
Would you stop mentioning the gosh darn rodeo?
She yelled.
Just open the bag, will you?
Rarity opened it. Inside there was a pile of berries, each a brilliant azure color. Rarity turned to her friend. She was almost speechless. But, Applejack, how did you know where to find them? Applejack snorted.
It weren't no trouble at all. Just wandered around till I found a bush of berries on the same color as those gorgeous eyes of yours.
Applejack frowned.
Your eyes are azure, aren't they?
Rarity leapt up and hugged her. Of course they are. Just as yours are the most delectable shade of green I have ever seen. Applejack smiled nervously and tried to slip out of Rarity's embrace.
Now, Sugar Cube, remember what we discussed.
Rarity, crestfallen, let her forefeet drop away. Of course. I understand. I won't forget what. She started to back away, but Applejack suddenly grabbed her around the waist and kissed her hard. Rarity struggled initially in surprise, but then she went limp. When Applejack broke the kiss, the unicorn pony looked at her incredulously. Applejack smiled shyly.
Well, kinda thought that maybe we could alter the arrangement just a tad. I mean, I am planning on going to the rodeo next year, since this year was a big blowout.
She shook her head at the sudden sad look on Rarity's face.
Nah, Shug, no more of those recriminations.
Rarity started to smile. So, what you're saying is that what happened to the Swayback Mountains? Applejack nodded.
Sure as heck stays in the Swayback Mountains, but don't mean we can't come back here whenever we wanna.
Rarity looked thoughtful. You know, Applejack, I have a feeling that these berries will be enough to provide me with azure for about a month or so. But I'll soon need to collect some more. She winked at the Earth Pony. And I'd just love your help. Applejack tapped Rarity on the chin with a hoof playfully.
I think that could be arranged.
She laughed. Anyone in here? A face suddenly poked through the flap of the tent, a face with bright and serious eyes and a shock of rainbow-colored hairs. Wait, Applejack? Rarity? The two ponies leapt away from each other. Rainbow Dash?
Rainbow Dash?
They cried in unison. Applejack was the first to collect herself.
What are you doing here, Rainbow Dash?
She asked. Rainbow Dash pushed herself away into the tent. She had a suspicious look on her face. I could ask you the same question, Applejack. She darted a sharp look at Rarity. Or maybe I should be asking you, Rarity. Rarity started to squeak in response, stepping away from the menacing Pegasus pony. But then Rainbow Dash laughed uproaringly. Geez, I'm just messing with you guys. She turned back to Applejack with a suddenly worried expression. But Applejack, seriously, aren't you supposed to be at the rodeo in Cold Springs? The first event's due to start any minute now. Applejack had managed to calm down after the sudden untimed appearance of their friend, as she quickly explained what the misadventure of the previous day in adventure. She found herself blushing uncontrollably, even though she was of course skipping what had happened between her and Rarity. But Rainbow Dash didn't seem to notice. Instead, she was horrified that the storm had caused so much trouble. That's the last time, did she do? She cried, shaking a clenched hoof at the tent ceiling. But I'm the one to blame, really. The buck's gotta stop with the boss, after all. She put her hoof back to her chin and looked thoughtful for a moment. Then a bright big smile zapped across her face. But I think I can fix this situation. You have to come with me. And Applejack?
Yeah?
Bring your lasso. Once outside the tent, Rainbow Dash whistled sharply. Moments later, a squad of Pegasus pony landed on the river banks nearby and trotted up to where they were standing. Red team reporting for duty, sir. The leader of the group, a mare. A mare with quizzical amber eyes, a yellow mane, and a grey-blue coat, saluted Rainbow Dash, and the 7 other Pegasus ponies followed suit. Rainbow Dash had wasted no time telling them what she wanted them to do. She turned to Rarity and Applejack, who were still waiting near the tent, and explained, "You're lucky we were checking the river for damage caused by the storm we royally screwed up last night." She gestured to the Pegasus pony that had split into two groups of 4. "But at least I can make it up for it. Let's go, squad!" And without hesitation, one group of ponies surrounded Applejack, each of them taking hold of her leg and lifting her straight away into the air.
"Hey now, wait just a minute!"
the Earth pony cried out in alarm. Rainbow Dash laughed. "We can't wait! Not even a minute! There's no time to waste if we're going to get you to the Cold Springs within 10 minutes! Raider was being lifted up as well, but she was squealing in excitement. "You're taking me too? So that I can watch Applejack? Oh, thank you, darling, thank you!" Rainbow Dash nodded and waved to them as the two groups of Pegasi ponies and their burdens swept over the valley. Applejack still shouting in alarm, they crested the ridge and were off to their way across the plains towards Cold Springs. Rainbow Dash watched them go. Another job well done. "It's true what they say," she said, looking up the sky. "Always bet on the dash." The end.